So it's my joy and privilege this afternoon to introduce my friend Chris Baines, who's in amongst the art collection at the back here, the sort of special commissions. I first got to know Chris, well, I suppose first encountered Chris, we're trying to think, I think it's about 79, 80. Last century, yes. In Kirkstall in Leeds, where I was leading a merry band of volunteers planting trees in Leeds. And Chris was working, we think, for Pebble Mill at the time, doing a series for them. And he came and interviewed us and gave us a great deal of encouragement about the trees that we were planting. But as I introduce Chris, I also want you to know that he's a passionate foodie and loves taking the food from the areas where he's visiting. So when he's with us, it's got to be venison from the forest. There's a great challenge for us to produce squirrel pate, I think, which we will do in due course, Chris. But that has an important part of linking to the area, linking to the natural history, linking to the livelihoods there. And each autumn, Chris brings apples from Wolverhampton to be pressed and bottled in Bewdley. He's been a great champion of urban trees, supporting the establishment of the urban forestry unit and the practice of urban forestry. And that includes raising a lot of concerns about urban trees. I remember you had quite a campaign about the cable companies who had the right to rip up our pavements and lay cables for our sort of multimedia experience without any great thought of the damage they were doing to the roots of the trees they were severing. Sometimes we see that clumsy lack of understanding and public engagement leading to massive outcry about trees, particularly I'm thinking of Sheffield, and I think you might touch on that in your talk. Above all, Chris is a brilliant communicator, able to project his passion for nature and wildlife to our attention in an informed and engaging way, as I think you'll agree after his talk. Just a little bit more of background. Chris also has a very strong passion for Sheffield through the links to his grandfather, Ben Baines, who was one of the Rivlin Valley artists. And I was going to promote your talk on the 11th of June in Sheffield, but I understand it's sold out. So you'll have to put your names on the reserved list or book a bigger venue, Ruth. No, City Hall, Crucible, you know, there are other places. But anyway, Chris is one of the UK's leading independent environmentalists. He originally trained as a horticulturist and a landscape architect. He taught landscape design and management and was given an honorary chair by Birmingham Polytechnic in 1984, now known as Birmingham City University, something like that. Yeah. And Central, it was UCE, wasn't it? Yeah. As an award winner and a broadcaster, he was one of the first presenters of BBC's Countryfile programme and has had lifetime awards from the RSPB and the British Naturalists Association. So we have in our midst someone who really knows what he's talking about, and I hope you will enjoy and learn a lot from what Chris has to say this afternoon. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, John. Just since you mentioned trees, something to ponder on while I'm talking, something I'm just really beginning to get my teeth into, excuse me, in London. I'm working towards a half-day conference, and that's on London plains. And London plains are obviously iconic in London, but in many other cities too, and they're extremely drought susceptible. If they're faced with drought conditions, then there's an internal fungus disease called Massaria, which the drought triggers, and Massaria's kind of effect on the trees is that they shed branches to cope with the drought. Now, I mention that because one of the great environmental initiatives of London is solving the water leakage problem. Millions of pounds, lots of bad press for the water companies about dealing with this terrible squandering of drinking water and the leaking of water mains, which are almost entirely the source of irrigation for those same street trees. And I think if there was a kind of an example of the inability we have to understand nature and then to do any kind of joined-up thinking about it. That's just an example. So as we replace the leaking water mains with plastic jointless pipes, we will see the trees, first of all, suffer drought, then start to shed branches, and before the second branch is shed, the trees will be chopped down. So there is a desperate need to deliver some greater depth of understanding and more joined-up thinking about the environment. I'm going to be talking in two halves, really. I wanted to use the opportunity to talk about what I see as John Ruskin's timeline legacy in Sheffield particularly, not least because that's where I was born and brought up, and all of my roots are in that city, really. And then to move on to the wider environmental issues of the day, and I promise you, finish up optimistically talking about things that are happening that are good, rather than what is terribly easy to do, which is to talk endlessly about the things that are happening that are bad. So I wanted to begin here, really. This is the Rivlin Valley, and this is the view from Bell Hag, which for anyone who knows about Ruskin will know this is a kind of an iconic place, because this supposedly is the view that inspired Ruskin to build his museum in Walkley. This is on the edge of Walkley. All of my family come from, on my mother's side and my father's side, come from Walkley. So it's an extraordinary kind of coincidence. And this is a painting by my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, painted in 1947, which is the year I was born. I was born in the spring. This was painted in the autumn for me. And so all of my life I've had this view from Bell Hag hanging on my mum's wall and never known the relevance of it until the last 3 or 4 years, when getting involved with the Wyre forest, discovering the link with Sheffield and Ruskin, and then discovering how very specific the view from Bell Hag is to that whole history. So that kind of raises the hair on the back of my neck, really, all those years, not realizing that this view, which clearly was the most inspirational view my grandfather could think of to paint at the time, was also so significant for Ruskin. But interestingly, I wanted to go back pre-Ruskin for a minute, because some of you will know that Sheffield has had other heroes, and one of them, internationally significant, is Ebenezer Eliot, known as the Corn Laws poet, and it's very timely, I think. The Corn Laws are being re-invoked in the context of Brexit constantly. Ebenezer Eliot was a metal working owner, came from Rotherham, lived in Sheffield. But really interestingly, this is a statue of him in Weston Park in Sheffield, and the caption for it says, Ebenezer Eliot, the people's poet, seated on his favourite rock in Rivlin. So he was 40, 50 years before Ruskin, already seeing Rivlin as a great inspiration. And more than that, he was one of the founders, anyway, of the Sheffield Mechanics Institute, which was an absolute precursor to the kinds of things that Ruskin came to Sheffield and initiated. So this place in this city has a very long timeline that goes back even further than Ruskin in terms of the core value that we're talking about, which is for hard-working people in grim working conditions to deserve and to benefit from access to nature and access to the arts, as you'll no doubt be well aware. And my credentials are, I think, pretty strange, really. This is a family wedding portrait, and the two people in the middle are my maternal grandfather and grandmother, Horace Parkin and Elsie Lee. And on the left is Charles Parkin, and he was the third, I think, Charles Parkin, who ran a company called Charles Parkin and Son, which manufactured wood carving tools. So absolutely at the core of what Sheffield was world famous for at the time that Ruskin was seeing the city as so special, and also well on into the last century. And that company finally packed up in the 1930s, as so many did. Again, another of the hairs on the back of the neck moments is that I went a couple of years ago with Ruth and various other people to visit Henry Swan's restored gravestone, and many of you will have been there, I suspect. And it sits in an 8-acre cemetery, massive, massive cemetery. And just literally across the path, as close as I am to that wall, is this huge grave of Charles Parkin, my great-grandfather. So there's something in the ether in Sheffield, clearly. On the other side of the family, so Elsie's father was Ezra Lee, who was a silver engraver. And if you look at the bottom of the stairs, you will see that extraordinary engraved knife by another member of the Lee dynasty. My great-grandfather, Ezra, who had a son called Ezra, so we're not the most imaginative of families on either side, 3 Charles Parkins and 2 Ezra Lees is going some, was presented to the old queen, as they called her, in the 1930s, I think, as someone who had worked in the same company for 65 years as a silversmith. So 2 bits of my family that are absolutely at the heart of the very thing that really inspired John Ruskin to select Sheffield as the place to build the museum. I knew none of that, but I'm pretty confident that they must have visited the museum. I mean, they were both engaged, all of them engaged very much with the arts and so on. But what Ruskin was much more concerned about, I think, in Sheffield was not so much the sophistication of silver engraving or the ownership of factories, but the whole kind of miserable existence of working, 996 in grim surroundings. And very quickly, actually, in the grand scheme of things, those kinds of qualities which drove him to think about the museum were engaged by him, of course, and you're all familiar with Benjamin Creswick's a wonderful story of the kind of person that this process managed to foster and the influence that then fed out into the wider world. But actually, I want to just move on a little, because within a generation, there was a different kind of hellhole that these people were actually being thrust into. The First World War was arguably, well, not even arguably, undoubtedly much worse than anything that the iron and steel industry of Sheffield could throw at its workers in the previous century. And you will also know about the Pals Brigades and the whole way in which recruitment into the First World War was very much about, well, peer group pressure, I suppose is what we would call it now. And that whole kind of experience continued to feed into the ethos that Ruskin had built into the museum and the way in which he was working in Sheffield. So these guys had moved from grim factory conditions into even grimmer trench conditions. And one of the things that's emerged for me in the last 3 or 4 years is all kinds of really interesting connections with real people. And if you can imagine coming from green and leafy South Yorkshire, or the West Riding as it was then, and then finding yourself in that kind of landscape, I think there's not much doubt that you'd be thinking about the green and pleasant land from time to time. You're very familiar, I'm sure, with the kind of images that were captured by the artists of the time, Paul Nash, capturing those kinds of absolutely devastating qualities that these guys were living in for, if they were lucky, they lived through 4 or 5 years of it. And one of the people that has emerged in the story that I've been kind of trying to uncover is this man, William Goodrich, who, and this portrait was drawn in the trenches by a fellow Sheffielder. So this is somebody who was, by this time in his, I think, late 20s, early 30s, who'd studied art before he went into the war. And one of his fellow soldiers did this drawing and sent it home to his wife, his young wife. And that artist, amateur artist, had a daughter, eventually, survived the war, had a daughter, and she got in touch with me because she'd read about the Rivlin Valley artists and sent me the drawing of William Goodrich from the trenches. If you're living in that kind of situation and you're creative, then even there you find an outlet. And one of the extraordinary things about this guy was that he was the main illustrator of something called Pelican Pie, which was one of those Wyre's Times kind of publications, produced in the trenches, published back in Blighty, for sale on the streets of the West Riding to local people to raise money for the widows and orphans of the people who were being killed all around them. And the version or the edition that I've got runs to about 36 pages of poetry and essays and jokes and cartoons. And William Goodrich as the artist of the front cover, and actually many other elements of that particular publication. So in the depths of despond, in the trenches, here was somebody from Sheffield finding a way of, in the grimmest of circumstances, finding a way of liberating his artistic passion. At the end of the war, then he came back to the landscape that he had grown up with, and this is the Rivlin Valley. And so, if you can imagine, coming out of the war in 1919, and then inevitably, I think, making your way back to the landscape that had been in your head for 4 years, and discovering actually that it was still there, and that it was greener probably than even you remembered. And this is a modern photograph, so the Rivlin Valley, if you haven't ever been there, is well worth visiting and walking through, because extraordinarily it still looks like this 100 years after Goodrich went back there. But in the Rivlin Valley at the time, there was a painter working, somebody called Robert Scott Temple, who was a Scottish academician, and by this stage, at the end of the First World War, was in his 70s, but was just the most fantastic painter of these landscapes, and had painted all the way through the war, obviously far too old to serve. What I can't find out is when he arrived, because he clearly travelled in Europe, and his paintings are collected in the States and so on, but he was, by the time the First World War ended, firmly established within the Rivlin Valley, and painting these kinds of extraordinary paintings of that landscape, really capturing the quality of it. And the important thing about him is that he then acted as a mentor and inspired people like Goodrich. So this is a painting by Goodrich in 1922, looking down into the Rivlin Valley. And if you think about what we now know about post-traumatic stress disorder, as we now call it, or shell shock, as they would have called it, we know that if you can be creative and surround yourself with natural environmental quality, that's a part of the therapy. And so Goodrich clearly had found a way of delivering that for himself. And in the last 3 or 4 years, about 15 paintings have emerged, almost all of them from farmhouses around the Rivlin Valley, where he was known to be willing to paint a painting of the farm, or of the view from the farm, or the horse in the farmyard, in return for sixpence and a meal. So Goodrich, coming out of a kind of, a fairly senior role in the First World War, was actually living from day to day on his painting, but in a landscape that was therapeutic for him. Now, it seems to me that that's really quite an interesting continuing strand of the Ruskin objective, and it continues right through to today. And there are interesting initiatives in the Help for Heroes movement of engaging people in that kind of way, and in horticultural therapy and in other kind of very practical ways. The very thing we were talking about before lunch of getting your hands dirty or doing something physical and practical as a way of recovering from the kind of traumas that Ruskin saw in the steel and iron works, and that these guys saw in the trenches. And The third thing that you need, it seems to me, in that kind of recovery mode is to find a way of hanging on to the, and particularly at the end of the First World War, the comradeship, the companionship, which we all know from Blackadder, if from nowhere else, was actually what kept people going. And that's where the marketing strategy of the PALS idea came from. And these guys would have lost many of their closest friends in the previous 4 or 5 years. So you're coming out of those circumstances, you're finding nature and an opportunity to be creative and rediscover your skills that have been suppressed for the previous 4 or 5 years. But in the case of Rivlin, they were also finding the companionship. They were accumulating, a number of them, around Scott Temple. He was living here in the cottages linked to Rivlin Corn Mill, which is about 3 miles out of the city. And at the moment, the count is about 9, but there are that kind of order of amateur painters, and in some cases, people like Goodrich who went on to be professionals, not just painting, not just absorbing that landscape, but actually painting with comrades, with colleagues, with compatriots. And one of the people that was painting with them was my grandfather, hence the kind of family connection. So this is a painting by, a watercolour by my grandfather of another cottage within that little community at the top end of Rivlin. So there's a really powerful message in there, it seems to me. And for me, what's wonderful is that it's illustrated by a collection of what now amounts to about 35 paintings, all of which were painted within a 5 or 6 year period in the early 20s, and which absolutely captured the moment when nature recovered the industrial past of the Rivlin Valley. In its heyday, there were 21 working water mills. And before the war, there were still, the First World War, there were still 4 or 5 that were fully operational. And they were still grinding scythes. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But in the past, they had been doing extraordinary things like polishing optical lenses. So a water mill with a whacking great mill and a mill wheel and a river flowing through it, doing something as sophisticated as polishing and grinding optical lenses. And the mill at the bottom end of the Rivlin Valley, which has the wonderfully quaint name of Mousehole Dam, had 4 wheels, and it drove 2 tilt hammers and bellows for a furnace and a grinding stone. And what they were producing was world-class anvils exported to the States. So the West was won on horseshoes beaten out on anvils that were produced in the Rivlin Valley. So this had been, for a couple of 100 years, an absolutely pivotal part of Sheffield's industrial history. And when they came out of the First World War, they were there to witness the end of that. The last of the mills closed down, and nature simply moved in. And what they were painting was an extremely romantic view of the recovery of nature after this industrial history, and you can read into that kind of connection what you like. But from my point of view, the magical thing is that my grandfather was a part of that. This is him, somebody who was an engineer, so the classic Sheffield Little Mester that you heard about earlier. He had a small engineering business, he employed 2 other people, and they were doing what the Little Mesters of Sheffield have done. I don't know quite which bit of the cutlery system he produced, but some of them were sticking the handles on forks, and others were polishing the prongs, and other people were sharpening the knives. So it was that kind of industrial network, and he was a part of that and hated it, to be honest. I mean, I knew him in his old, well, when he was younger than I am now, certainly. He did it, it was a 9-to-5 job, or a however many hours a week job. What his passion was getting out into the Rivlin Valley and beyond and painting and walking up in the hills beyond. And what you need to know about the Rivlin Valley at this stage is that it flows down from what we now think of as the Peak District. It's one of the 5 rivers that flows into the heart of Sheffield and that drove that whole sustainable energy-driven industry that was by this time had already been usurped by by coal and steam and so on and so forth. So my grandfather was a painter and an engineer, so the classic kind of latter-day example of the kind of person that Ruskin was pitching at. And he was involved in all of that in the run-up to this event, which is the next bit of the timeline, I think. The mass trespass, which some of you will know began in Manchester and Sheffield, was people like my grandfather getting more and more angry that having come through the First World War, fought for a land fit for heroes, discovered that actually the heroes weren't allowed in because the land was owned by a few robber barons who owned the hills and employed gamekeepers to keep them out. So the mass trespass was another chapter, really, in the demand to have access to nature. If you're working as hard as people were, with as few resources, being able to get out up the Rivlin Valley or up the Hope Valley and out into what is now the Peak District was something that you would get very, very passionate about. And in 1932, the mass trespass was really the beginnings of the development of what eventually became the National Parks Network. And that has had a worldwide impact, without question. So I believe that there is a direct link right the way back through John Ruskin to Ebenezer Eliot of bloody-minded revolutionary people in Sheffield with a determination to get access to nature where they are, where they live, or on their doorstep, at any cost, really. And I was lucky enough when I was presenting Countryfile all those years ago to actually get the chance to interview Benny Rothman, who was the young firebrand who led this, one of the 2 or 3 people who led the mass trespass. And by the time I interviewed him, he was in his 80s. And we had the resources then in the BBC to actually have a helicopter to fly him to the top of Kinder Scout, so that there was no way he could, get out of the car park on his own by this time, but actually to take him up to the top of Kinder Scout to relive the mass trespass. So there's a really exciting environmental story, I think, which runs all the way through Sheffield's history, right up to today. And some of you will know that Sheffield is now, sadly, celebrated around the world for all the wrong reasons. A city that has been so proud of its greenness and marketed itself as one of the greenest cities in Europe, has just seen 6,000 street trees chopped down because of the complete incompetence of the local authority to actually establish a contract for road maintenance, which didn't involve a risk assessment, which led to thousands of mature, perfectly healthy trees being cut down. And there are the mass trespassers, there are the revolutionaries chaining themselves to trees, going to jail, determined that somehow or another they have to stop the lunacy and maintain their physical contact with nature. And there is a direct link back to that First World War story. I think the most shocking of all the things that have happened in Sheffield is that this is a street, a mature avenue of trees, which was planted, as you can see from the plaque, you probably can't read it from the back, as a memorial to the boys from the local school who had been and fought in the First World War and not come back. So this was an avenue in their school street planted with trees which were all chopped down at 5 in the morning. I mean, if somebody had driven a bulldozer through the local war memorial, there would have been an international scandal. But in fact, that's exactly what's happened here. So the struggle continues, I think it's fair to say. And I couldn't resist putting this in as well. They must have run out of trees, it says there. It's the guy climbing up the lamppost to chop the lamp off. I mean, that is the kind of view in Sheffield, really, that how much more damage can they possibly continue to do on the strength of just a rubbish piece of municipal contract management, which is what it boils down to. So, as you can tell, I'm passionate about my links with Sheffield. I'm absolutely convinced that if Ruskin was around today, he would have been chaining himself to one of those trees, or at least paying somebody else to go and chain themselves to one of those trees. And that has its roots, absolutely, in the deep, deep desire to have nature in your life. And that really is essentially what he's about, at least on my side of the argument, and many other things that he's about as well. But from the environmental point of view, that very direct connection is at the core of my understanding, anyway, of why Ruskin is so important and has such a powerful environmental legacy. I'm now going to move on to the beyond Sheffield. There was a time I worked as an advisor to Yorkshire Water for quite a while. I chaired an advisory board for them. And I sat in on a meeting where they'd just bought the waste management company in Nottinghamshire at the time when water companies were acquiring all kinds of other businesses. And I sat there and I could hardly believe it when one of them described North Nottinghamshire as Greater Yorkshire. They do say you can always tell a Yorkshireman, but you can't tell him much. And that kind of confirmed it. I'm now going to move away from Sheffield and Yorkshire and talk a little more widely about the environment. This is a drawing which you can see on the wall there, an iconic part of Ruskin's history. And I do wonder what he would make of my favourite pastime, which is absolutely transforming that landscape. So there are some very negative things that I think it would be impossible for Ruskin to have ever imagined would happen to the landscapes that he loved. And it is difficult to remain optimistic about some of those situations. And I'm just going to flip through these briefly, but as you know, he wasn't a great fan of driving railways through wild landscapes. So God knows what he would have made of HS2, which is whacking its way through. And just this week, an announcement that the extension to HS2 is going to be going through 19 ancient woodlands. There is a hugely damaging kind of mismatch between the need to travel through landscapes at even faster speeds so you can see even less of the detail that we've been talking about, and at the same time wiping out much of that detail into the bargain. So there would be no shortage of campaigns, I don't think, to occupy him if he was still around. Things like battery farming would have been, I mean, unimaginable 200 or 150 years ago, I imagine. But there are more positive things to talk about. This is the issue of the age, isn't it? The plastics issue, thanks to David Attenborough and Blue Planet. We are now at last waking up to the international horror of the plastics revolution. And the River Thames is just an example. So many of you will have travelled much more widely, and if you've been to the Indian subcontinent, for instance, you will know that you can walk across rivers in some places because of the extent of the pollution, the plastics pollution. But one of the things I just wanted to kind of link with this is that there are actually, even here, there are some quite interesting examples of the arts being woven into the issue. So this is what was an installation as a part of the whole City of Culture. Looks like a pile of stones off the beach in Hull. What it actually is, if I just go up close, is a mountain entirely made up of sea-washed plastic, polystyrene and other kinds of solid plastics, washed in exactly the same way as millennia of washing of rocks will produce big, soft-shaped products. So here is an artist trying to shock people and surprise people by saying, actually, you need to look at this differently. And I just think we need very much more of that kind of an imaginative way of engaging the arts with the environmental issues of the day. And it does happen. Some of you might have come across an organisation called Common Ground 20 years ago, which was very much set up to deliver exactly that kind of idea. It was rather faded with the two zealous women who ran it, reaching an age where they wanted to do other things, I guess. But there is a job to be done, and it does seem to me that the Guild is an organisation that might just drive the overlap, the interconnection, weave these issues together more effectively than we generally do as a society. In my lifetime, I trained as a horticulturalist, and I always say I spent 3 years being taught how to kill everything. In the 1960s, horticulture was the post-Second World War revolution of mechanization and chemicals. Those are the two great legacies that came out of World War II, I guess. And in my lifetime, they have done for most of the natural heritage that I knew as a child. I couldn't resist putting this in. This was an advert. When I started studying horticulture, the first lecture from the professor of chemistry, he introduced himself by saying he was proud to say he was one of the team who'd invented DDT. And we thought nothing of it. In fact, we were rather admiring of him at that stage. By the end of 3 years of agrochemical propaganda, I suppose came out a different person. This was in the late 60s, so I was a student leader in 68, and that was a good time to be a student leader. And when they were ripping up the paving stones in Paris, the students, I was organising joint barn dances with the local PE college. So the revolution has all kinds of forms. But nevertheless, I came out, having learned how to kill everything, determined to actually do something else with my horticultural knowledge. And what we've seen in my lifetime is just the disintegration of the rural landscape. Ironically, there's been a reintegration of much of the urban landscape. The post-industrial derelict land of the Black Country, which is where I've lived for most of my adult life, has got greener and more joined together through dereliction and industrial abandonment. But the farming countryside has lost its integrity to a very large extent. Now, if you think about that in the context of Ruskin and his patronage and the whole need to observe the fine detail of these landscapes, there's a deep-rooted tragedy there. The landscape that he was passionate about is increasingly difficult to find. And so what we've seen is just endless loss, with nature squeezed down into the margins of highly productive but sterile landscapes. It does get better. It gets more optimistic, I promise you. And if you want to find birds' nests or primroses, you really have to look to the margins, and you have to look very hard because for the most part they've gone. This is a spotted flycatcher. When I got my first garden at the age of 22 or 23, I had spotted flycatchers nesting in my garden, as did many, many, many other people. And in that 50 years, there has been an 87% decline in spotted flycatchers. And I always say that when I was occasionally had the treat of being driven in my painter grandfather's car through the Derbyshire and South Yorkshire countryside, one of my jobs at the age of 7 or 8 was to have to keep getting out of the car to go and scrape the moths and insects off the windscreen and the headlamps. When did you last do that? So the invertebrate population, certainly of Western Europe, has absolutely crashed. And as a consequence, bats and a whole range of other different kinds of insect-dependent species have also crashed. This little bird has the double challenge of flying all the way from south of the Sahara, so it's got all kinds of things to deal with, and 87% decline in 50 years. And you don't need me to tell you that, you know, if you had a buddleia bush in 1970 or 80, it would be covered in butterflies in the summer. I go out and photograph it if a peacock butterfly now turns up in the garden. A peacock butterfly. So there has been just a spectacular decline, thanks to the Second World War technology essentially being applied rather blindly. And ironically, I think one of the, I hesitate to say this because you never know who's in the room, but one of the few little bits of silver lining to the Brexit black cloud, as I would see it, is that this may mean the end of the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy. That has to be a good thing. Who knows what it will be replaced by? It could be replaced by something even worse, of course, but the optimist in me thinks that maybe we will have had long enough to learn that we need to find a way of managing land which is much more sustainable and delivers the kinds of qualities that we are missing. There is good news. If we're going to restore, if we're going to revive, if we're going to bring back those qualities that I remember from childhood, fields full of wildflowers and butterflies on the edge of Sheffield, cuckoos, that whole range of things that have just disappeared from most of our lives, then we need pioneering places to do it. And the Wyre Forest, and I, as some of you will know, I chair the Wyre Forest Landscape Partnership, and John and I get to work there quite a bit, is one of those places where a change in forest management, a revolutionary change in forest management actually, is now beginning to deliver the restoration of primroses and bluebells and pink campion and ragged robin and all these other wonderful things that are in danger of just becoming a folk memory. And one of the other initiatives of the last couple of weeks has been the publication of this book of lost natural words, that words like weasel are no longer in the dictionary because they're not seen as relevant to society anymore. Well, part of this is about making sure we don't lose those kinds of qualities. And the Wyre Forest is a place where that is beginning to happen. And the thing I think that would bring joy to Ruskin's heart is that it's being delivered in a productive way. So the trees that are being felled to let in the light and stimulate the butterflies and the wildflowers are yielding timber crops that have a commercial value and that produce something tactile and valuable. But they're also being managed, these woodlands, with the artists. And so there is frippery there. I mean, this has, as far as I know, this isn't a corral for wild pigs. It's just a piece of artwork of no value and of every value. Again, being produced as a part of the coppice management that is being used to bring back the wildflowers. And just this kind of tiny detail, which I think is so powerful, really, in the context of a landscape revival driven by hard work and productivity, but with still a little space for this kind of modest creativity. So the Wyre Forest is one of the good news stories, and it's absolutely driven by the Guild. And our objective, as Clive knows and John knows and many of the rest of you know, is to actually deliver Ruskin's ambition for landscapes to be beautiful and peaceful and fruitful. This is just another example of the potential good news story. This is a painting that's familiar to everybody, I suspect. I have a great friend with the wonderful name of Jeremy Pursglove, who is a river ecologist, essentially, who's used this painting for years with water engineers to show them what a really healthy chalk stream should look like. I mean, forget the dead body in the middle of it. Every other aspect is all about bank vegetation and water crow's foot on the bed of the stream and so on and so forth. And interestingly, this is the River Wandle. And again, the Ruskin experts amongst you will know that the Wandle is very significant in Ruskin's life. It's also the place where William Morris had his workshop. And now, much of it looks like that. But many of the streams in that part of London, Wandle included, have gone through a period of looking like this, where every vestige of its natural quality is removed. This is actually a stream with the wonderful name of the Quaggy Brook, and anything less quaggy is difficult to imagine. But what's been really exciting in the last 10 or 15 years is that there has been a revolution going on. This is that same stream after the Environment Agency have removed the concrete, removed the hedges, and actually restored it, not as a nature conservation exercise, although actually there are now otters travelling through that part of Lewisham. There are water voles in that landscape again, and there are kingfishers that people can see. But all that work done in the name of flood defence. So this is engineers working with nature rather than against nature and delivering the kinds of qualities that inspired John Ruskin. That for me is justification for the way I've always worked, I suppose, really, to work with the people who have the resources, but with a bigger agenda. And the people who have the resources, generally speaking, use them to destroy and damage. But if you can engage creatively, then it's possible. And this is the big turning point that I think we're a part of now. The optimist in me thinks so anyway. where we're beginning to see those resources turned to better advantage in terms of the kinds of qualities, the kinds of accessibility, the kind of contact with nature that we've been talking about, well, some of you all your lives, I guess. So there is very good news. Just remember that actually it's not driven by Ruskinian ambition. It's very often driven by big business and economics, the very things that he would have found pretty uncomfortable, I suspect. This is the middle of Shrewsbury on a bad day, and I'm not sure that the owners of that particular tandoori could see the joke, but I'm sure most of the people who paddled past could. And I wanted to use this image as well, because you're all very familiar with it, because it's on the front of the leaflet that's promoted today. And when I first saw that image, and it's streamside vegetation, as you know, mosses and lichens and wood sorrel, I was immediately struck by how similar it is to the edges of the Thames, just 300 yards away. There are many places along the Thames that have that kind of fine detail in them. And I've been president of something called the Thames Estuary Partnership for the last 20-odd years, working as a very small not-for-profit organisation to build a better conversation between a whole range of different interests in the Thames. But if you look carefully at some of the older river walls, you'll see the kinds of qualities that Ruskin was just brilliant at capturing. And that kind of detail turns out to be absolutely central to the health of the river. What you all know, I'm quite sure, is that 70 years ago, the Thames was biologically dead. There really was, I mean, no doubt a few unmentionable things living in the mud, but essentially no fish, no birds, very little could survive the levels of pollution. That's changed. There are now something like 125 different species of fish in the Thames, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the key to that has been a whole range of different things, and that's really what I wanted to talk about in this context. But one of the really interesting stories within this is the survival of migratory fish. And I didn't know this until I chaired an advisory board for Thames Water, looking at how to moderate the impact of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which is just underway now. And as it happens, not only did I have Thames Water engineers and people from the Environment Agency on there, but I had a really brilliant fish ecologist. And he taught us that actually the tidal Thames is really important for a whole range of fish species, some of them extremely commercially important. Sea bass and Dover sole. It's the best Dover sole fishery in Europe now, the Thames estuary. And that many of those species have a life cycle which involves them travelling up and down the river. So sea bass will spawn out in the shingle beds out in the outer reaches of the estuary where the wind farms are. Will then travel as tiny little creatures into the creeks of the salt marsh around the Essex and Kent coast, grow a little bit, and when they're about the size of a postage stamp, then they have to get all the way up to fresh water, top of the tide, and then they come back to the sea. And the way that they do that, because they're too small to swim against the tide, is that they surf, basically. They travel up on the rising tide, and then they have to hang on somewhere when the tide goes out. So twice a day they're doing this surf ride up the Thames. It takes them several days to get up to fresh water at Teddington. And to do that, they need somewhere to hang on. And for a lot of the outer reaches of the city, there is this kind of quality of detail that can provide the kind of stepping stones. But when you get to the middle of the city, it's sheer stone walls and there's nowhere to hang on. And one of the things that emerged out of the work that I was helping to facilitate was a discovery that the engineers were all assuming that their structures needed to be as streamlined as possible, because that would be elegant, and were told in no uncertain terms that actually you need to produce really rough structures that will create whirlpools and eddies and sheltering places, because then your new structures as a part of the super sewer can serve as these stepping stones for the fish travelling up and down the river. Now, what's so interesting about that is that that knowledge emerges from really detailed observation, exactly the kind of thing that Ruskin was so good at. But the proof of the pudding is spectacular. There are now salmon in the Thames, many of you will know. What you perhaps don't know is that there is a thriving population of harbour porpoises that is gambling outside the House of Commons and wondering what the hell's going on inside, even as we speak, probably. And the reason there are porpoises there is because there are fish there. It's not rocket science. If you clean up the river and you then sustain it in a way which allows the fish fry to travel backwards and forwards, then you will bring in the predators. And one of the interesting asides is that some of you will know the Trafalgar Tavern at Greenwich, famous for whitebait for centuries. And I'd always thought, well, you know, what is whitebait? Whitebait is actually all those fish fry that are travelling either from the sea upstream or from the freshwater downstream that all have the misfortune to meet outside the tavern in Greenwich, get scooped out and fried. So fish fry in a whole new kind of way of thinking of it. But that story is, I think, just the latest iteration of this need to bring people together, to have a better conversation, and to really focus on the detail. And I mentioned that I'm involved with an organisation called the Thames Estuary Partnership, which you will probably never have heard of. But what's interesting for me is that that brings together the fish ecologists, the researchers from London Zoo, the people who've been studying the sea walls and the river walls and actually building new old river walls against the concrete to increase that kind of habitat. Of course, it involves the people who litter pick and the people who row and recreate on the river. But most significantly and most surprisingly, I think, it also brings together the very kinds of organisations that Ruskin would have found so uncomfortable. So the main reason that the river is alive and well now is multi-million-pound investment in sewage treatment works at Beckton and elsewhere. The reason that there isn't too much damage to the spawning beds of the Dover sole is because we bring in the mineral extraction industry, and something like a third of London's aggregates for building are dredged out of the Thames estuary. If you don't get that happening in the right place, then you wipe out the fish communities. And then you've got Dubai ports at the bottom end of the estuary needing to have the river dredged to allow them to get their big ships backwards and forwards. And what the Thames Estuary Partnership does is bring those people together. So I had an interesting day last year sitting in on the dredging subcommittee of the Thames Estuary Partnership, which is kind of second only to the paint drying subcommittee, I suspect. But actually absolutely fascinating to see how, if you get these various people playing to their respective strengths and listening to one another, you can actually, in their case, produce a map which minimises the damage and maximises the transport and minerals production. And everywhere I look, and certainly everywhere I work, that relationship is the new norm, I would say. That industry that in the past has been damaging is beginning to be a part of the solution. This is a very optimistic view of the world, I realise, but this is another project I'm involved with where the National Grid is spending £500 million removing pylons from national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. Now, it's their engineers that know how to do that. It's people like us that have driven that to happen. And these landscapes will be in a form they haven't been in for 70, 80 years. And the other side of that coin, the other side of the coin which has big business collaborating, and the thing that I think would gladden Ruskin's heart more than anything else, is the real practical engagement of people with nature where they are. So there has been a burgeoning of interest in that, and I'm very pleased to say I've been a part of that. And so we're now seeing bumblebee conservation as a personal thing, butterfly conservation as a personal thing. This is my garden in Wolverhampton. I've been a part of the promotion of the whole idea that gardens can be the beginnings of the rebuilding of landscape. That's the view from my window, and it's small, but it's full of bees and birds, and it's in the heart of Wolverhampton. It's not out in the Peak District, it's not miles from anywhere. And that whole engagement of people with their immediate landscape, I think, is really important. And I'm just moving across here in the hopes that this works. And it will work. International Dawn Chorus Day is something that I started 40 years ago. And it's not 40 years, 30 years ago. It's such a simple idea, but it's absolutely, I think, at the heart of what Ruskin was talking about. It happens every morning in the spring, wherever you are. The Dawn Chorus in the middle of Wolverhampton is brilliant. It's even better in the Wyre Forest, so John tells me. I don't believe him. But this year, in about 3 weeks' time, there will be a programme on the radio, and this is the 20th year it's run, organised by Irish State Radio, which begins at midnight our time, but begins in India, and travels all the way across to Ireland, waking up with the birds, meeting the ornithologists who can tell you what they're listening to in India and Norway and Israel and a whole range of countries. But what they're all doing is saying, you don't need to know the name of these things, just listen. Just take a minute to listen. And this week, the results of this year's Big Garden Birdwatch came out. 500,000 people getting up and sitting and counting the birds in their garden. So there is a revolution that's been going on, and hopefully some of us can see the link back to what Ruskin was talking about 150 years ago. Very few of the people who are doing Big Garden Birdwatch would know there was a connection at all, but it doesn't matter. Actually, the essence of it is what matters, and I think it's probably healthier now than it has been at any time in my life so far. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Chris, that was absolutely fantastic. So much to take in, actually, and to think about. I think we have got time very briefly for some questions, if there are any. I'm sure there must be. So let me just allow you a quick slurp of water and can come back up here again and take questions.
No, stunned into silence.
Yes, that's the word. Well, I've got a question, and I had one burning. I was very taken with the fact that you're talking here about some organisations which are quite small but very influential, others that are very large, but lots of people doing the same thing together, and obviously got a life of their own, haven't they, in that state. But coming back to the Guild and the type of thing that Ruskin would be engaged in if he were around now. You mentioned the trees right at the beginning, but I just wondered if there's anything else where you think that, in a sense, there's a gap in the market. I was about to say terrible, like the commercial thing, but in a sense, somewhere where the Guild could actually act where somebody else is not at the moment.
Well, I think it would be good to have more of a think about it, but see whether there is perhaps once or twice a year an opportunity to handpick thinkers from as diverse a range of organisations as you can imagine, maybe even including government ministers, and sit them round a table to address one of the complex issues of the day. It just seems to me, living so close to Birmingham for so long, I'm very kind of aware of how significant the Lunar Society was, which some of you will be familiar with, which was just such a simple idea that you just bring bright people with influence together for conversation. And extraordinary things happen. And I just don't think there's enough of that. I don't get very many opportunities, and if I do, it's usually, coincidental. It's not structured. And I do think that the Guild has enough gravitas to be able to invite people and that they would come. It wouldn't cost very much, but it might just actually start a few positive hairs running.
Thank you very much. Ruth.
I'm Ruth Machado. I run the Ruskin in Sheffield project for the Guild. Absolutely, everything you're talking about there is about breaking down those silos and people coming together and having those multidisciplinary conversations feels absolutely at the heart. And I just think that Ruskin Land is the perfect place for those conversations. Because you can have those conversations anywhere, but it's the same as having this exhibition here. Having conversations like that where you're immersed in nature and you have the backing of Ruskin, you've got, that history is really, really helpful. So, and I know that's the kind of thing that's starting to happen at Ruskin Land anyway.
Yeah, I agree, of course, but I also think that we have to be careful about the essence of that not actually distancing people. So interestingly, on the radio yesterday, or I think it was, there was a piece about St Dunstan's churchyard, which is, 5 minutes walk from here. A beautiful garden in a bombed-out church in the heart of the city of London. And if we can have those conversations in places like that, you're not starting out on the wrong foot. I do think, much as I love the Wyre, that actually for many, many people, you've kind of already lost them because actually it's not part of their familiar territory. So we need more than one opportunity. I'm certainly not suggesting we should stop doing that at Wyre, but I think we need other places too. Yeah.
On that subject, though, I've been to Bewdley and the Wyre, so I've seen some of it as well, how wonderful it is. But I'm very conscious that people like the Woodland Trust, which I think must own acres and acres across the UK, I'm very conscious that bodies like the Woodland Trust don't often have productive woodland. They're great at planting the trees, and if you've noticed that. And perhaps there's an opportunity for the Trust to work with people like the Woodland Trust to sort of showcase Bewdley, the Wyre Forest, Ruskin Land there, but to get people to think about the productivity. It's making the links that you've so eloquently shown, exist. Because a lot of people like the planting of the trees, but they don't really think further ahead as to what to do with the trees. So there's so many connections that could be made there, perhaps.
I think you're right, but I think you're probably doing them a disservice. I think you're confusing their fundraising and marketing strategy with what they're really doing. Even more extreme is the RSPB, who has a complete mismatch between what they really do worldwide and what their members think they're paying for. And in the case of the Woodland Trust, the thing that really motivates people is buying woodlands and planting trees. If you actually go and look, or you talk to the Woodland Trust, of course they have to be productive. They have to generate. Now, I'm not saying they couldn't be more imaginative and that there aren't good and bad examples, but certainly, I think the idea of neglect and abandonment is certainly not on their agenda. And more power to your elbow. If we can get better partnerships with them. And I have to say that the Woodland Trust has been hugely supportive within the Wyre. So it is happening. What's been much more interesting in the Wyre, I think, than anything else is the fact that we now, and I still can't quite believe it, those of you who know about this kind of world will know that the Forestry Commission comes out of one box and Natural England comes out of another box, and at the end of the day they go back into their boxes, generally speaking. We have a memorandum of agreement signed by the chairman of the Forestry Commission and Natural England to manage their 2 holdings in Wyre jointly. That's 2/3 of the Wyre forest. So the coniferous commercial forestry part, the timber part, is now being rolled over to deliver more wildlife of one kind or another. And Natural England's National Nature Reserve is now being selectively harvested by the Forestry Commission to produce high-value timber and increase the amount of wood pasture and sustain the coppice woodland. Now that, I think, is a revolution that astonishes anybody who's had to work with both those organisations for any length of time. And it's happening in our forest. So there is cause for real celebration in that, I think, and more people need to know about it.